Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful.
وعد الله لا يخلف الله وعده ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون.
It is a promise of Allah. Allah faileth not His promise, but most of mankind know not.
يعلمون ظاهرا من الحياة الدنيا وهم عن الآخرة هم غافلون.
They know only some appearance of the life of the world and are heedless of the hereafter.
والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. صدق الله Sadaqallah Azim. My dear respected brothers, elders, learned scholars, sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If one takes into account the discussion or the discourse, the importance of da'wah to non-Muslims and our failings, particularly in modern day times and indeed in history, there are certain practical examples that we can take into account or view, specifically in the context of getting information out to the masses. If one looks at a practical example, in 1933, in Germany, a week before the general elections, you find that the strategically timed, what was then called Reichstag fire, that was the home of the German parliament, took place and was subsequently blamed on communists through an elaborate mechanism and means of vicious propaganda, creating a consensus in the minds of the masses, using tools of writing, using the tools of the medium of the radio, and of course using the tools in terms of public communications in the sense of mass rallies that were heard. And what happened after the fire took place, they subsequently blamed this on the communists. President Paul von Hindenburg's emergency decree subsequently followed. And as a result of that, the civil liberties were suspended, the Weimar Republic democracy ended, and you find that Hitler and the Nazi Party assumed power, and the fascist powers were basically enough for them to basically take over the Europe and indeed much of Eastern Europe subsequently. You find further examples. On the 7th of December 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he manipulated Japan to attack Pearl Harbor and subsequently giving him the opportunity to enter into a war which he had wanted initially from the early 1930s, but had to convince the pacifist public that it was necessary to do so. Initially he had told the people, mothers of America, your children will not go to war. But subsequently the advent of Pearl Harbor took place, and through an elaborate means of propaganda, they created a mass consensus using the tools available to them, and subsequently the United States entered into the Second World War. Now what we find from these two examples, and there are hundreds of like-minded examples, is that people in power, be it in the political establishment, be it in the religious establishment, be it in the academic establishment, have the mechanisms and the means and indeed the tools, and use it to the ultimate level in terms of getting certain information out to the public. Howsoever false, howsoever corrupt, howsoever manipulative that information is, they have the means and the mechanisms of getting this out to the public. And unfortunately, we as Muslims have, in a sense, failed in terms of our initial injunctions, as you would find in different passages of the Quran and various permutations of the Prophet himself, enjoining us not only to create an Iqra community, a reading community, a community that is educated, but a community that delivers a message to different ends of the earth. We have retrogressed in the sense of becoming a La Iqra community. I was having a chat with one of your leading members yesterday, and the consensus or the suggestions were made, which is in fact a consensus throughout much of South Africa and indeed many parts of the world, that there is a level of confusion, even in terms of terminology, in terms of usage of terminology, where sometimes people confuse da'wah with islah or with reformation. So in a sense, people believe that they're engaging in da'wah, when in actual fact, the methodology of communication, or the method, or the level of discourse is somewhat insular, or somewhat leaning, or adjoined, or necessitated by its very nature, targeting a particular group or a particular audience. In other words, we are retrogressive in the sense of inwardly looking as opposed to outwardly looking. We haven't created a discourse in terms of which we can get information across to the masses, and in terms of unpacking the basic spirit of what Islam means, certainly to us as Muslims, and indeed in the context of the 21st century. If you take into account the whole notion of haqq, truth, that truth per se is one and cannot be two-sided, then consequently the emotive faith, which is your iman, which is based on emotion and religion, and your cognitive faith, which is your iman, which is based on reason, are basically supposed to be united in a single organic whole. And so there should be no conflict between faith, between iman, and there should be no conflict between reason, between ilm, between knowledge. So not just is the acquisition of knowledge the duty of every Muslim man and woman, but also once you acquire that knowledge, it enjoins upon you the obligation to in fact spread that information to different communities, different tribes, and different backgrounds. If one has to look, for example, at the verse of the Quran in Surah Al Imran chapter 3 verse 103, which is quoted quite often, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبِّ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Hold fast per se to the bond of unity, or to the rope which Allah has created in the Ummah, and do not divide yourselves into sects or into any groups on any grounds whatsoever. And when you take that particular command, laying in conjunction with the whole idea of Muslim unity, and bearing in mind that historically speaking, when unity was in fact reached, when it was the epoch, you find that society flourished, information flourished, people communicated the message of Islam, da'wah, if what you call da'wah, it permeated society at large. But unfortunately, when you find division, and each and every single group regards itself as being on the sole right path, then you find that not only does retrogression take place, but you basically fall into your own idea of self-destruction. Now, in respect of that, in Surah Azab, chapter 30, verse 32, the Quran says, مِنَ الَّذِينَ فَرَّقُوا دِينَهُمْ وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. It says, from amongst them, who divide themselves on their petty religious issues, to paraphrase the Quranic, and divide themselves into mutually hostile groupings. And each and every single grouping regards itself as being on the right path alone, and every other group as absolutely contemptible. In other words, every other group which is basically kafir, which doesn't agree with you, you label them. It becomes far more easier to label them. Only you in your narrow grouping are absolutely right, everybody else is wrong, nobody knows what they're doing, as a result of which we form artificial constructs. Constructs that are erected, that are artificially constructed amongst ourselves, and so in doing so, the very element of da'wah falls, the information that you can get out to the masses falls away. For example, you find a particular passage, Ya Ahl al-Kitab, لا تغلوا في دينكم, or يا أهل الكتاب تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم ألا نعبد إلا الله ولا نشرك به شيئا ولا يتخذ بعضنا بعضا أربابا من دون الله. The message or the exhortation in those passages are to who? Not to Muslims, not to people who are so-called mu'mins. Ya Ahl al-Kitab, O people of the book, Oh, humanity, Ya ayyuhan nas, not Ya ayyuhal Muslim. So the point is that if you have a book which is universalist in its nature, it speaks to the masses, it's not a Muslim religious book, then what does it behove upon us as individual human beings and as Muslims, men, women, what does it behove us to do? Do we sit upon it and just keep it for ourselves? Or do we basically impart the universal message to humanity at large? What's our role? What's our purpose? Why is it that today we have become succumbed to elements of propaganda in the mass media? Whereas we should in fact be the leaders in terms of information, the leaders in terms of education, the leaders in terms of dissemination of information. Why is it that illiteracy is highest amongst Muslim countries? Why is it that education is so low? Why is it that not a single Muslim university is on any of the top 100 universities of the world? Not one. Yet even if you look at the idea and the concept of the university per se, when was the first? The idea, the concept? Education. It was an Islamic idea. Yet when it comes to literacy, when it comes to education, when it comes to knowledge, we are at the lower ends, the lower ebbs of society. So again the warning goes on in Surah Al-Imran.